Okay, I come here tonight with a lot of feedback, but to tell you the stories of the shipwrecks of Cape Cod. As you probably know, Cape Cod has so much history to it, and one of the things that stands out in Cape Cod history is shipwrecks. And one of the great introductions to that came from a guy you might have heard of, a fellow named Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, of course, best known for Walden and other books that he wrote around Concord, but he also wrote a book called Cape Cod, which was published after his death, right around the time of the Civil War. And that book began with a scene of chaos. And he was introduced to the shipwrecks even before he got to Cape Cod. He was on his way to Cape Cod. And he wrote about a Provincetown steamer, which should have gotten in the day before, had not yet arrived on account of a violent storm. And as we noticed in the streets, a handbill that had a headline of "Death, 145 Lives Lost at Cohasset." So we decided to go by way of Cohasset. And coming upon the wreck of the brig St. John, Thoreau was confronted with a vast morgue and is stunned by the chaotic destruction rendered to the ship by the sea. The largest timbers and iron braces were broken, and saw that no material could withstand the power of the waves. That iron must go to pieces in such a case, and an iron vessel would be cracked up like an eggshell on the rocks. The shipwreck becomes a symbol of a fragile, eggshell-like barrier between life and death. Thoreau is thus forced to consider this on the shoreline, grappling to understand the dynamics of the sea and the shore as a kind of existential threshold. That was from the folks at the Thoreau Society. The outer beach of Cape Cod, and this is where I'm focusing on, and mostly between the time frame of 1872, somewhere around there, until about the middle of the 20th century. I will be leaving out some noted shipwrecks, particularly the Witta and the Pendleton, because there are people that tell those stories pretty exclusively and pretty well, so much that they're in movie form and museum form and other such. So I will be focusing on some maybe more obscure type of shipwrecks. Cape Cod has, the outer beach of Cape Cod has been referred to as the graveyard of ships. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 shipwrecks occurred there between the time of the earliest European settlers, 1626 to be exact, and the mid-20th century. Before 1872, if you were involved in a shipwreck, or there was a shipwreck going on, the only people who could really help you out were the people from the Mass Humane Society, and they were mostly driven by volunteers. And Mass Humane Society built a lot of these little shelters along the outer beach for when people were shipwrecked, and if they did survive and got to shore, they had at least some shelter to go to. And they would also organize rescues. If they saw a shipwreck like Thoreau saw, or many other kinds of shipwrecks that happened well before 1872, they would organize a rescue party using a large boat and go out and try to rescue them. But of course, this was, we're talking about volunteer efforts here. This was not a really great organization. I mean, they were good at getting out there and doing what they could, but it wasn't nearly enough. As I mentioned, it started with the Sparrowhawk in 1626 off of Orleans, off Gnostic Beach, and this involved some of the earliest English settlers. They ended up having to go to Plymouth, the survivors of it. Of course, the Witta, which I mentioned also in 1717, and the Somerset, the British vessel that ran aground off of Provincetown, and over 400 British soldiers were taken prisoner and marched to Boston. These were some of the better known early wrecks, but then I'll introduce you to a few other more obscure wrecks, such as the Java. This happened off of Gnostic Beach in February of 1832. They were carrying 585,000 pounds of coffee, and also over 13,000 pounds of nutmeg. And they threw it all overboard to help free the stranded vessel when they hit the bars. And there was a fellow named Bernard Sherman, and he wrote a book about 100 years ago called Souvenir Letter from Cape Cod, and he said the coffee was free to anyone that would take it away. My father got a boatload, and in it there were nutmegs loose in the coffee. I ate some of those and came near to losing my life as a result. The doctor was called and succeeded in saving me. This is a lesson. Don't go eating things from shipwrecks, because it's dangerous and all kinds of things can happen. People did benefit from it on occasion, and they did get stuff that was, it was okay. But a lot of times, no, if it's been in salt water, and I don't know how this worked out with the cargo from the Lutzen, and this happened in 1939, and it ran aground on Gnostic Beach. One man died, but when they were trying to, when the ship first ran aground, but they were also carrying 208 metric tons of blueberries on board. And it turned out that a lot of people in New Orleans had blueberries for the next year. Another one that was carrying food was a boat called the Francis. It was a German bark, and it ran aground Christmas week of 1872. And it had a crew of 20, and they all survived except for the captain. He died, not because of the shipwreck, but because he was sick. The cargo was sugar, and a lot of people would, you've heard of moon cussers. It wasn't so much a case of moon cussers, it was more like wreckers. People would go to shipwrecks and start taking whatever they could from shipwrecks. And in this case, it was a lot of sugar, and they were able to secure a year's supply of sugar. But as I mentioned, there was one man that died. And this was also an organized volunteer rescue. It was at the very dawn of the life-saving service, and it was organized by the station keeper of the Highland Station, actually, Edwin Worthen. He had been appointed, but they hadn't built the station yet. So Worthen organized a whole crew of local volunteers. They dragged a whaleboat across from the bayside to head of the Meadow Beach in Truro, and on wheels through deep snow, because this always happens in a bad storm. And this was a bad winter storm. And they rescued the crew of the Francis. The captain had been ill, and he died shortly afterward at the Highland House right near Highland Lane. And Worthen ended up, he saw to the man's burial, and he was still tending to the grave some 30 years later. He served for 35 years as keeper and was still tending to the grave. The people of the life-saving service and the Coast Guard, they were always very dedicated and very attached to the people that if they lost somebody on their watch, they took it rather personally. And even in the case of the captain of the Francis, it meant a lot to Keeper Worthen. The Francis itself, you can still find the remains of it exposed every now and then at low tide at head of the Meadow Beach in Truro. It still sticks up, the timbers are still there in the surf on occasion, and you'll find that actually with a lot of other shipwrecks, which I'll point out some of them here in the program. The life-saving service came into being in 1872. It eventually merged with a few other divisions of the government and became part of the U.S. Coast Guard in 1950. But the life-saving service, its first superintendent was a fellow named Sumner Kimball. He was from Maine. And Kimball was already with the Treasury Department, and they oversaw the Revenue Marine Division, and that became the U.S. Life-Saving Service. And Kimball knew if he was going to have this new life-saving service working properly, he was going to have to get money, and he was going to have to get a lot of it. So he ended up being the ultimate federal bureaucrat. And he went and hired a writer, a guy named William O'Connor. And O'Connor would write these reports, and he would get the keepers' reports from the stations and take the details of it, but exaggerate the facts a little bit. Boy, they don't do that, do they? He would exaggerate the facts, but keep the facts the facts. So, you know, maybe a 10-foot wave became a 15-foot wave, a 20-foot wave. But when it came time to send these reports to Congress and get money, it helped get his money. So he was able to do that a lot in the 1880s and 90s, and eventually he became the first one to retire with a pension. And so he was, and eventually the men in the life-saving service and then the Coast Guard were able to get pensions as well. Because before that, before the Coast Guard, a lot of these guys were forced into retirement at an early age, sometimes because they would sustain all kinds of horrible injuries on the job. So eventually, 1872, the life-saving service is born. And they're set up, stations are set up all up and down the eastern seaboard and other parts of the country too, around the Great Lakes and on the Pacific coast, but dominantly on the East Coast. And as I mentioned earlier, 4,000 shipwrecks. It's somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000. Nobody ever really kept track. It's one of those things that there's so many that unofficially happened or maybe they didn't know about, but there were just thousands of them that happened during that time. And it's been said that if all the wrecks were raised, all of those shipwrecks were raised, one could walk from Provincetown to Chatham without getting their feet wet. Wow. That's a lot of wreckage. Those stations, there were 13 of them, that went from Provincetown all the way down to Monomoy. And it started with Wood End Station in Provincetown, around inside the hook, if you will, at the end of Provincetown. And then you had some other stations along the way. You had High Head had a station, Waste Point had a station, Peaked Hill bars. This was a particularly busy station, Peaked Hill, because this is where a lot of shipwrecks happened. It was also known for, there were two Peaked Hill stations over the course of history, and one of the first one in the early 1900s was sold off and eventually fell into the hands of the family of Eugene O'Neill. And O'Neill used to stay out there quite a bit until eventually he and his wife stopped going there, and then he gave it to his son, but then it fell into the ocean because of the erosion. So, and then they also had another one that the ruins of it still stand today. It actually burned down, and I think it was in the 1950s. But this was that station as well. Near Highland Light, there was a station, and also at Ballston Beach, they referred to it as the Panic Station. And the Cahoon's Hollow Station, you know what this is now? Yeah, that's right. That's right, Beachcomber Restaurant. That was sold off by the Coast Guard, I think it was in the 1940s. And then it became a restaurant, and then it was sold to the current owners who still operate it now as the Beachcomber. And God willing, that won't fall into the ocean anytime soon. Because the parking lot certainly is. And then there was the Gnostic Station. That was at Coast Guard Beach. This is the first Gnostic Station. You can tell it's a different structure. And back in those days, there were also houses down there that were very close to the station. And a lot of the surfmen that worked at the station lived there. This location is now underwater. And it's the Coast Guard station that stands there now was established in 1935. The town of Orleans had a station near what they call Poche Island in Orleans along Gnostic Beach. Then there was the Old Harbor Life-Saving Station in Chatham. That now sits on the sand dunes in Provincetown. overlooking the water. That was moved in November of 1977, just in time too, because you see how close those waves are? When it was first built in the late 1800s, there was 600 feet separating the ocean and the station. And here, this was taken right before 1977, I think it was, and the waves are right at the door. Had they not moved it, they put it on a barge and actually hauled it up to Provincetown. And it sat in Provincetown Harbor during the blizzard of '78 and survived somehow. But this, had they not moved it, it would have certainly have been destroyed. And also going down onto Monomoy Island, they had a couple of stations as well. So back to okay. And that again is the Gnostic Station, and I mentioned it became the station that you see there today. In 1935, it was starting to fall apart, and they had they had a couple of visitors there one day. Actually, a whole group of people were picnicking out on the beach there in front of the station, and a storm breaks out. This is in July, big thunderstorm. And everybody runs into the station. You could do that in those days. And they continued their picnic. And they're sitting there and starting to make a bit of a mess with sardine cans and bananas and stuff like that. Banana peels are everywhere. And the keeper goes and reprimands the people, starts giving them, hey, clean up, you know? And then he finds out who one of the people is. It's Henry Morgenthau, who's the Treasury Department of the United States. He's the Secretary of the Treasury. And so he works his way into getting a new station with Morgenthau, because Morgenthau was looking to spend money. This was during Roosevelt's New Deal, and he was actually looking to spend a few bucks, so it didn't take him much really to convince him, but he took him on a tour and everything and showed him around and said, hey, we need this, and next thing you know, 2 weeks later, he got the okay to get a new station. And by 1937, it was up and running, and then they tore the old one down. So the surfmen from each of these stations would patrol the beach. They would send somebody out on patrol, mostly at night, and every 6 hours or so, and they'd send the guy to walk in one direction for several miles, and then go back, and then come back, and then they'd also send somebody up to the north. And they were looking for ships in distress. And in between each of these stations, there were these little halfway houses that they built where the guys would check in with the other guy on patrol, and they would leave these little tags that they had, these little trinkets that were numbered with their number. If you were the #1 surfman at a station, you were the top dog other than the keeper. And if you were #7, you were probably somebody that was just hired off the street. So it kind of went that way, but that's how you identified yourself, and you left that there, and that's how they knew you completed your patrol for the night. And they also had these carts, which they called apparatus. The apparatus were the tools that they used in the life-saving trade. And one of them was a surf boat. And the surf boat would be used when conditions were a little bit more manageable, if they could get it through the surf. The ships would often run aground on sandbars, not too far from shore, but it was also just far enough out to be a problem. So the surf boats, they would take that out sometimes and bring the men in that way that were on the boat. Other times, when they were also patrolling the beach, they would be carrying something called the Castaigne flare. And the Castaigne flare, they would hold up when they saw a shipwreck. It not only signaled to the men on the ship that help was coming, it also was a signal back to the Coast Guard station or life-saving station up the beach that they'd have somebody watching there as well, and they'd see the flare, and that's when they would send help. And they would bring the apparatus down to start the rescue. They had, sometimes the carts would be pulled by horses, other times they would pull them themselves, and then later on in the 1920s and 30s they would use small tractors. Another rescue, if they couldn't get the boat out there, they had something called a breeches buoy. The breeches buoy was used, it was like a zip line that went from the beach all the way out to the ship, and the ship would be maybe 500 yards out at sea. even. And this little cannon they would use, called the Lyle gun. The Lyle gun had a weight that they put in a projectile, and they would shoot it out with a whole long rope attached to it. And the rope was wrapped up in something called a faking box. And it was wrapped up, and it was endless amounts of rope. And they would attach it to this projectile, put it in the cannon, and shoot it. And the projectile, they would shoot it up over the masts of the ship. And that's how the people on the ship would fasten it, and that's how they would create this zip line. And they also had something attached to it called the tally board. The tally board was on one side in English, the other side was in French. And it explained to the people on the ship how to fasten the line and how they could set up the line so that they could be rescued. If you didn't speak French or English, though, I think you might have been out of luck, because that's the only two languages that they were in. So when it came to setting up the breeches buoy, proficiency was a must. The best crews could fire the Lyle gun, rig a breeches buoy, and haul a person down from the wreck pole in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Crews had a 5-minute limit to complete the drill. Failure to do so was cause for dismissal. So you had to be efficient. So now I'll get to some of the other wrecks that happened. This particular wreck, there was really not a lot that could be done. It was pretty overwhelming. It was the wreck of the Jason. It happened December 5th, 1893, near the Pamet River Station in Truro. They'd been at sea for 10 months. They'd been coming from India, heading for Boston. And they were carrying 10,000 bales of jute, which is used to make fabrics. And they barely survived a cyclone in the Indian Ocean, and 25 of the 26 men on board perished, because most of them climbed up into the mast. And that's what they did on these shipwrecks a lot. They climbed up into the mast, because the ship would start breaking apart while it was after it had hit the sandbar, and that was the only way that they could, avoid being hit by waves and everything like that were coming in. So, unfortunately, the masts all fell. They killed everybody that was up in the masts, except for this fellow, Samuel Evans. He was the sole survivor, and he washed up on the beach because he had fallen into the water before everybody else had climbed up in, but he had fallen into the water and clutched onto the bale of jute, and he got rescued by washing ashore on this bale of jute. So he gets pulled in, and then this is him the next day after the shipwreck. You can even still see the shipwreck in the background there. And he gets sent home to England, and his father writes this letter to the U.S. Life-Saving Service, says he'll be setting out again, I trust on a more favorable voyage. He ships out again on that vessel, and he reportedly died when he fell out of his bunk. After that whole ordeal, he fell out of his bunk. This wreck was the Monte Tabor. This happened off of the Beacon Hill Bars area, Province 10, in September of 1896. And on this particular wreck, it's believed that the captain and 2 of the crew members who were so distraught over the incident took their own lives. 6 men survived overall out of the 12-man crew, but 3 of them killed themselves. It was an Italian crew, and the 3 men that killed themselves was the captain and 2 of the mates. And after this had all been cleared up, there was the Italian consulate explained that it's an unwritten law among Italians that an army general should die on the battlefield by an act of his own hand rather than live to acknowledge defeat, and that a commander of a vessel should go to the bottom of the sea with his ship rather than meet his fellow men and acknowledge his incapability. So to the members of this race, to kill oneself is an act of bravery. So the captain had been got among the crew, and he said, "Saluda," and he took him and the two men went into their cabin and killed themselves. The captain shot himself. The other two men cut their throats. And the other men got onto what was left of the wreckage and floated ashore, and they got ashore, and the life-saving service was there to help them out, and they were thrilled. And, oh my God, we're rescued, this is great. Of course, they really couldn't speak, their English wasn't very good, so one of them said, "Craft struck in the dark, see nothing, all black, big water come on us," and they got flung up onto the shore. So they get onto shore, and then word gets to the sheriff in Provincetown about what happened here. He's not buying it. He thinks it's a mutiny. He doesn't buy this suicide story at all. And he locks them up for the night. And the headlines here were all saying suspicion of mutiny is lurking. The crew tells their story, declare that the captain shot himself and the mates cut their throats, and they launched an investigation. Well, turns out they were cleared. But still a lot of doubts were left over that. They all got sent back to Italy, but it was a lot of doubt was cast over that whole incident. Fast forward a couple of years now, this is probably one of the most noteworthy tragedies at sea that ever happened off of Cape Cod. And this was the wreck of the Portland. It happened during a storm that you might know of as the Portland Gale. Happened Thanksgiving weekend of 1898. This is the Boston Globe a couple of days later. It says over 125 lives were lost. It was a lot more than that. It was closer to 200. Just on the Portland. The Portland was a steamship named for the city in Maine. And over Thanksgiving weekend, a lot of travelers were headed back from the holiday and shopping and all that. And they were heading back to Portland. And this is one of the many ways you could travel in those days. You could either take a steamship or maybe take the railroad. Well, they were competitors. And they were trying to get as many people on board as they could. And the Portland loaded up that night, that Saturday night, was heading back with all these people on board. And there were warnings of an incoming weather system. And Captain Hollis Blanchard wanted to go anyway. He was told, wait until 9 o'clock. And he said, 7 o'clock, he said, we're going. He still thought he could beat the storm. Problem was, there was 2 storms coming. It was one of those situations, you had a collision of 2 weather systems. And the whole thing exploded and turned into this monstrous nor'easter. And so the Portland starts heading up towards Maine, and it gets caught in, it starts snowing like a half an hour after it leaves, and by 9 o'clock, all hell breaks loose. The Portland is being tossed around, blown around, gets blown back, it's heading up the coast, and it gets blown back out towards Provincetown. And several other ships, too, are in trouble. Before this was all over with, about 500 people died, somewhere in that area. And that was not only the Portland, but several other vessels as well. And there were a lot of bodies coming ashore in Eastham, and people were checking out at the railroad station. You know, they wanted word about loved ones and things like that. And they also had quite an overload at the local funeral home in Eastham. A fellow named Rick Lindholm, he had emailed me shortly after I wrote a story about the Portland for the Cape Codder a few years back, and he told me that his great-grandmother talked about the Portland when he was young, and about the bodies that were found on the beach in Eastham, and that the funeral home on Bridge Road in South Eastham was full and the ground was frozen, so they had to keep the bodies in the barn behind the house right nearby, and in the funeral home. It was overflowing with bodies at that point. So it was a pretty tragic event, the entire Portland, claiming almost 500 lives. Jump ahead now to 1902, St. Patrick's Day, the Monomoy disaster. and I'll go through this pretty quickly. There were two barges involved here. This was off of Monomoy Island, and the Wadena and the Fitzpatrick. If you ever go to the Chatham Lighthouse there, South Beach area, there's a monument that's right in the front there, and that's what this monument is for, all the people that died aboard during this disaster. The Wadena got stuck out there. It was a barge, but two barges were out there, the Wadena and the Fitzpatrick. The Wadena flies a distress signal, and they're panicking, yet they were safe. But since they could have just rode out the storm, but they were panicking, and this distress signal was given, so that means the keeper, Marshal Eldridge, and his 6 crew members at the Monomoy Station had to get out and go rescue them. So they go out and they try to do this rescue, and they've got the whole crew, plus all these people from the Wadena aboard the surf boat in stormy seas, and the boat gets thrown around a couple of times, and the members, the barge guys, panic. And pretty soon there's only one man left after the boat got tossed around. His name's Seth Ellis. He was the only survivor. And a dory comes over. A fellow named Elmer Mayo was aboard the Fitzpatrick. And he comes over and rescues Ellis, pulls him to his dory, gets him to shore. Well, Mayo's acknowledged as a hero, called the Hero of Monomoy. He's awarded medals by the various humane societies. They had a fundraiser that raised $36,000 for the families that were lost in the disaster. And a lot of these were local families in Harwich and Chatham. And then these guys were pretty attached for the rest of their lives, and they died 2 months apart many years later, 1935. Ellis ends up being awarded a gold life-saving medal, and he's promoted to keeper of the Monomoy Station. But the U.S. Life Saving Service did acknowledge that even though that they didn't need to make this rescue, but since they were called, they did, and that's what the members of the Life Saving Service did. Whenever there was a signal of distress, that's when they went out and did their job. Probably very ill-advised, though. I do a program on rum running quite a bit, and this is just a small sample of that. But this was a shipwreck that happened in Provincetown, the Annie Spindler. And nowadays, you go to Provincetown, there's a restaurant called the Spindler. But the Annie L. Spindler was a rum runner that ran aground, 1922, right at the foot of the Race Point Station. This ran up, they were carrying at least 600 cases of whiskey. But when they hit the beach, within a very short period of time, the local townspeople were already hitting it, and probably pulled a good 100 cases off for themselves. Then the Coast Guard got to it. Well, this was during Prohibition, and they said to the guy, to the captain, we're going to have to confiscate this and have to arrest you. And he says, hey, wait a minute. I'm not registered here in the United States. A lot of these rum runners would register themselves as foreign boats. Say, not only the rum runners, but also the men offshore who were running the motherships in Rum Row. That's a whole other part of Prohibition. But long story short, they ended up getting their cargo back and getting transport of another boat to take their booze to Bermuda, Nassau in the Bahamas. Well, they weren't going to Nassau. They were saying they were going from St. Pierre to Nassau. Well, they weren't going there. They ended up just taking the boat and dropping their cargo somewhere else along Cape Cod shores, like they had planned to. But they had a good story going that, yeah, oh no, we're a foreign boat. So they ended up salvaging most of their cargo. The case of the Anna Sophia, this was in 1934. This was a two-masted schooner that was caught up in the ice off of Nauset Spit in 1934. And I wrote that it had involved Cape Codders, Coast Guardsmen, captains, and canines, because they were The crew of the Gnostic Coast Guard Station rescued this 5-man crew and its poodle mascot, Spud, in sub-zero temperatures. What had happened was they went ashore. They were trying to get out to this boat that was offshore, and there was ice piled up. It was frigid. It was probably 10 degrees out, if that. And there was just ice piling up along the beach. They couldn't get an opening to get their boat through, to get it out there. And plus there was a lot of ice in the water. They finally found an opening, got the boat through, got out there and brought everybody back. And it was, and then they get back there, and the dog from the boat that was in distress comes out and runs immediately to the Coast Guard's dog. And the people, though, who were involved in it, this is the crew, you can tell they're not too happy. But the guys who did the rescue from the Coast Guard, oh yeah, they're all happy. So they did their job, they got that done. And that was one of the better instances, and they brought that vessel eventually up to Provincetown and got it fixed and running again. That wasn't always the case. If you've seen any of my talks prior to this, I've done a lot on the author Henry Beston. And Beston wrote a book called The Outermost House. And it's one of the more significant Cape Cod books ever written. It was instrumental in inspiring the Cape Cod National Seashores establishment. Beston stayed on what is now Coast Guard Beach. He built a small house there. Had a sort of a Thoreau type existence out there. And his book, The Outermost House, is one of the great Cape Cod nature books ever written. And I would dare to venture to say it's even above Thoreau's work. Beston also frequently entertained the Coast Guardsmen at his little house that he called the Forecastle on the beach. It was 2 miles south of the Gnostic Coast Guard Station. And they would come by on their patrols and stop in for coffee and whatnot. And also Beston had his own uniform that they gave him. So he was pretty tied in with them. And that's below, you can see that's one of the Coast Guardsmen and his family visiting Beston at his house. And even one of the covers of the Outermost House had a kind of a Coast Guard theme to it. Beston, prior to writing the Outermost House, had written an article for World's Work magazine, and it was called The Wardens of Cape Cod. And it was about these surfmen that patrolled the outer beach. And he had a great deal of admiration for these men, because he had been in the war himself, World War I, as an ambulance driver in France, and saw some of the worst of the worst. And then when he came back here and saw what these men were doing on the outer beach, he really admired what they were doing. They were putting their lives on the line, much like soldiers do, but not to take lives, but to save lives. And he was really heartened by that. And the whole experience out there, he even documented some of the wrecks that he had come across, and one of them was the wreck of the Montclair. The Montclair actually made some headlines just this past November. It was a vessel that ran aground in Orleans in 1928. The remains of it were exposed in November, and everybody was rushing down there to see it. And the Boston Globe did a story. They called me about it, actually. The Montclair, Beston wrote, there's been a great wreck, the 5th this winter and the worst. On Monday morning last, shortly after 5 o'clock, the big 3-masted schooner Montclair stranded at Orleans and went to pieces in an hour, drowning 5 of her crew. The problem there was they probably could have saved everybody if the Orleans station had been fully staffed. Well, it wasn't. They only had a keeper and 2 surfmen on duty. So when that ship ran aground, they were terribly understaffed and weren't able to save everybody. The Montclair was carrying 25,000 bundles of laths, which is wood planks. A lot of people thought the Montclair was a rum runner, actually. But the The wood they were carrying ended up, there's another instance where people prospered, the locals prospered by treasure on the beach with all that wood. And the interesting thing that happened here, with the 5 men perished, 2 of them did survive. They were from Nova Scotia. Those are the 2 Coast Guard men, 2 of the Coast Guard men flanking the 2 men that were saved. And there's another one of the Coast Guardsmen over there. One of them was a fellow named Nathan Baggs. Nathan Baggs had been rescued, and he wanted to go and help the Coast Guardsmen during the rescue to get some of the men back. Well, they said, no, you're freezing to death here. You got to go back into the station. Well, he was offered a job with the Coast Guard before he decided, no, I'm going to go back to Nova Scotia. Many years later, this happened in 1927, 28. It was, he went back to Nova Scotia, and then in 1962, National Geographic did a story on the Cape Cod National Seashore, and they had a picture in there of some kids jumping off of a shipwreck, an old shipwreck that was on the beach. It was the wreck of the Montclair. And he saw that picture and he said, I'm going to go back there one day and see that again. And he did. He actually went back a few years later. And also acknowledged that, yes, I should have joined the Coast Guard. And one more rescue I'll go through here. Wreck and rescue is the mission of the rescue mission of the Castaigne. This happened off of Wellfleet, South Wellfleet, February 17, 1914. The Castaigne was an Italian vessel that had gone down to South America and was carrying a load of guano up to Weymouth, to a fertilizer factory.
That guano.
And so I can't imagine this was a very pleasant voyage to begin with. But the voyage began in Montevideo, Uruguay. And the men were dressed, because down there at that time of year in Uruguay, it's summer. Well, they were dressed for summer. And then the ship began going north, past the Tropic of Cancer. It wasn't summer anymore. Winter was coming, and they were still dressed for summer. And then the ship was getting lashed by storms. It started to fall apart as it was going up towards Cape Cod, and eventually ran aground in between the Cahoon's Hollow Station and the Gnostic Station. It actually was pretty close to the Marconi Wireless Station. And that ended up being involved in the rescue mission here too. They were also carrying not only guano, but these large bullhorns. That was also part of the fertilizer process. And these things ended up being all over the beach after this ship ran aground. And this is the place they were carrying all this stuff to, was the Bradley Fertilizer Company in Weymouth. Another place I can't imagine that's very pleasant, because it's a big fertilizer factory. That was like a community all its own. And so it involved the Gnostic Station and its crew, which, and also involved the Cahoon's Hollow Station in Wellfleet and their crew. So they're both summoned when this ship hits the bar on the morning of February 17th, about 10 degrees outside, nor'easter raging, winding down, and that's what kind of drove it into the bar in the first place, and these men are in bad shape at this point. 2 of the men that were involved from the Gnostic Station were Lewis Collins, he was the #1 surfman, and his son Bernard, or Bernie, and he was all of 17 years old at the time. Bernie used to go with his father to a lot of the shipwrecks. And the Collins family now, if you go into Eastham from Orleans, you go through the Rotary, and then you're going into Eastham, and on the right-hand side, you see the town cove, and there's some cabins there, and a shucking house is what they call it. That's Collins Cove. That's the family, same family that built those cottages. But Bernie, as I mentioned, was always involved with the shipwrecks, and you can see that little tyke there to the left of that boat. That's Bernie. That's how far back he goes with it. So, and also, this was the keeper of the Wellfleet Station as well, Cahoon's Hollow. So, When they got there, they tried to do first they tried to do a surf boat rescue, and the tide was still high, they couldn't manage it. Then they tried the breeches buoy. They shut they did everything that they needed to do, but the men on board were so frozen, they couldn't handle it. They were that weak and that distressed. Many of them had climbed up into the masts and froze to death because the ship was getting pounded by waves and sprayed by freezing spray. So a lot of these men climbed up and actually froze to death up in the masts, and they were like mummies that had actually, they were still clinging to the mast, but they were frozen to death up there. Another one was hunched over the wheel box of the steering wheel of the ship. And Bernie went and sawed off with an axe, actually cut it with an axe, cut off the spoke to free the man because he was frozen to it. And eventually the man died after they got him to shore. And then they had to cut down, he also had to help get the men down out of the masts who were frozen to the masts. And that was also a pretty gory thing as well. So some of the men survived and were brought to Boston. Some had to undergo amputations. It was a pretty bad scene overall. The captain had fallen out of the mast and hit his head on the deck. And almost as soon as that happened, a big wave came in and swept him overboard. They never found him until a year and a half later in Nauset Marsh in Orleans, 10 miles to the south. That's the newspaper article that explains that. He's found 10, what had happened was he was swept over, probably buried almost instantly in the sand, and then was uncovered and still half frozen when they found him. So he was still pretty well preserved, unfortunately. But the entire thing was pretty rough on everybody involved. Young Bernie, too, ended up being permanently affected by it. He was so badly frostbitten. But everybody should have gone into the cabin, because if they had done that, they would have survived, like the cat and the canary that were on board. The canary, they got into the cabin, and there was the cat and there was the canary in its cage. The canary was singing. It died shortly afterwards, after they got it to shore. The cat lived, and they brought him to live at the Marconi wireless station. They named him Castaigne. And Castaigne, who looks kind of like Morris the cat, stayed there and lived there for many years, and is rumored to have started a long lineage of stray cats. So they were, that had a good ending in some ways, but it was still a tragedy. But Earl Rich wrote in his book, Cape Cod Echoes, about his early experiences in historic Wellfleet. He said, what manner of men were these hardy specimens to have chosen the livelihood they did? They were, in my opinion, the last of a breed. Come hell or high water, and with utter disregard for their own safety, the safety of a shipwrecked sailor clinging to the rigging of some stranded vessel came above all else to them. That brings this program to a conclusion. I have some programs coming up. On the Cape, I'll be leading an Outermost House walk at Cape Cod National Seashore on June 16th. Also, my program, Henry Beston's Cape Cod, which I did here a few years ago, will be at the East Providence, Rhode Island Public Library on June 18th. And I also have a program, Wardens of Cape Cod, which I have various dates in Dennis, Brewster, and Chatham so far for this summer. More information on my website, dwcapecod.com. I have business cards in the back. I also have copies of my books, A Brief History of Eastham and Henry Beston's Cape Cod. You can get them 23 and 13 respectively, or both for $35. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, in the back there.
What was the average age of the surfmen?
That varied quite a bit, actually. Some of them were kids just out of school, practically. And then some of them were men, if they could still work. Some of them were in their 50s or 60s,
Wow.
if they were still in good enough shape. A lot of times, though, these men were forced into retirement, and there was, they were just let go. They weren't given anything. So, like I mentioned, Lewis Collins, he, for example, sustained some pretty serious injuries. A couple of back injuries, like when they went out in a boat, he got rolled under the surf boat. That's just one example of what could happen. And then there were instances during the Castaigne rescue where a lot of men were submerged in that icy water for a long period of time. So you were subjected to some really bad conditions, and that would take a toll on you health-wise. So, but the ages varied. A lot of them, some of them stayed on and retired at a ripe old age. Some of them lost their lives too. So it did vary. There were other younger men too. I remember a few years ago I met the widow of a surfman he only stayed a couple of years. She was about 100 years old when I talked to her. And he's mentioned in the book The Outermost House as one of the surfmen. And he had only stayed on a couple of years because she said he was scared to death of going out and scared to death of the health risks, and then went and did something else. But he was quite young when he went to work for them. So yeah, it did vary quite a bit. Yeah.
I was wondering, the shipwrecks, there's so many of them that even today that you said that the pieces are left. How many did they cause more shipwrecks? How much did the debris cause more shipwrecks in the New England area?
None that I know of. The debris from those shipwrecks?
Yeah, because you said that there were still some that at the bottom that they found.
Yeah, they get buried in the sand, and then they get, the storms will unearth them over time. Those haven't caused any shipwrecks after the fact, or none that I know of anyway. They just, once they're wrecked, a lot of them got buried very quickly, or were scattered on beaches, or what have you. But none that I know of that actually caused any of the wrecks. The wrecks usually happen because they were in really bad weather conditions and were going around an area that was treacherous to navigate. And this was before the Cape Cod Canal. Once the canal was established, it opened during the 1930s, as we know it today. It became much easier for navigation. But before that, they had to go around, and that involved the shoals of Monomoy, and the Pilgrims even encountered it. When they first came over, the first spot of land they spotted was Eastham, and they were heading for what they called Hudson River country. So they headed south, and they came upon Monomoy, and they almost stranded there. And then they turned around and headed up into Provincetown Harbor, stayed there for a while before they went to Plymouth. So that whole situation of the outer beach and its shoals just caused so much problems. That's what caused all the shipwrecks, with that and adverse weather conditions more than anything else. Yeah.
What year did the surfmen stop operating?
They gradually stopped there's still Coast Guard stations out there and everything, but they began to gradually close them down, in the 30s and 40s especially, because there was not a need for them as much. Not only because of the canal, but because of technology and improved shipping and everything. Everything was just getting better. So they didn't really have a need for all these stations. A lot of them began to gradually close, and now there's only a handful out there. But in fact, very few of those structures are even still around, except for the beachcomber. And you can find the ruins of, say, the Beacon Hill Station and the High Head Station, but most of the other ones are gone, yeah, or they're being used for something else.
In your examining all this history and that, did writings or anything from Edward Rose Snow fit back into it?
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely.
The
Edward
kids-
Rose Snow's-
The kids, we could listen to them on WBZ last night, talking shipwrecks,
Yeah.
pirates, lighthouses, and all that.
His books are great, and I would recommend them to anybody. Edward Rose Snow is just, he kind of fell into the job by accident, I think, but he was probably one of the most noted historians of Outer Beach history, Coast Guard, lighthouses, shipwrecks, all that kind of stuff. He's written a lot of great books. I definitely would recommend them, yeah. But yeah, I've done a lot of reading of Mr. Snow's material, definitely. Anyone else before we wrap up? Yes.
Were many ships intentionally shipwrecked, by looters?
That's a story that a lot of people dispute. And I haven't seen anything concrete on that. If anything, over the course of history, Cape Codders were very sympathetic to anyone that was out on a vessel, and if they were wrecked, they would actually try to help. They didn't want to see people wrecked. And eventually, but there were wreckers though, that once, they went and got sugar or blueberries or whatever else washed ashore. That was a thing. But the intentional moon cusser storyline, some people swear by it, other people will tell you, no, it's absolute nonsense. So it depends, I think it depends on who you talk to. I haven't found much evidence of it myself, but there's a lot of other historians out there. So it's kind of up for debate more than anything. Anyone else? Okay, one more. There. One
I
more.
asked you about the training that had to do back in those days, and because, he seemed to have very little equipment and the clothing and things like that, where he dressed like ordinary guys,
Yeah, they were trained, but they had training for it, and you had to do it, learn how to do those breeches buoy drills and everything in a certain amount of time. But I think it's something that they probably perfected over the years. I'm sure it was probably pretty crude early on, and then they got a little bit better at it just over the years. But it was, of course they had to do some kind of training for it. But it was something that evolved over time, I think, more than anything. All right, we can call it a night here. Thank you for coming.